So, hi, welcome all. Welcome to another Scrum Wednesday. Today with us we have Mark Noneman. He is a seasoned Scrum practitioner, seasoned trainer. He's one of few people in Scrum work to have like full gamma of courses under his belt. He can teach just about anything. I was lucky enough to have PSM2 with him, so I can highly recommend it. He's also very well versed with metrics that matter, with the EBM. EBM here being the enterprise. Oh my God, evidence-based management. The joke of electro body music is always, taking my thoughts on sideways. And today he'll basically give us an insight into what EBM actually is and how can we use it to make business agility more meaningful. Mark, here you go.
Thank you, Bogdan. That was very kind of you. I appreciate that. Yes, Mark Noneman, and I'm with Scrum.org as a professional Scrum trainer. I'm also with ProKanban.org as a professional Kanban trainer, and also do some work with the large scale Scrum, or less, as you may know it, and a little bit of work with SAFe, not so much anymore, but I used to do work there. And as Bogdan implied a bit, that I've been working with Scrum.org around this idea of evidence-based management for actually quite a number of years. So we're at the point now where we're beginning to roll it out to clients. We've been doing some testing with people to see how that works. And so that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. And to do that, I'd like it to keep it interactive because people get more engaged when they get to participate. And to do that, we're going to use a technology called Mural. And some of you are probably familiar with Mural. I know Bogdan is because he used it in our class together. And I know Miro is another technology popular in Europe. So it's sort of similar to that. And in the Zoom chat window, I'm going to paste a link to the Mural that we'll be using today. So if you can open that link, it needs to be a web compliant browser like Chrome or Firefox or something like that. And some of you are popping in now. That's great. For just a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you how to use this technology. If you know how to use it, don't just kind of sleep quietly for a couple of minutes. I know it's evening time there. And I'm going to share my screen to show you this very quickly. All right. You see my screen? Yes. Very good. All right. So a little bit about me. You can see on my screen here. You'll have access to this Mural for a while. By the way, this link will work for at least 90 days. So you can come back here and look later if you wish. I'll make it read only after our session today, just so that you can kind of see what we did say. And a couple of things about Mural, just very quickly. On the right-hand side, you see the outline. I have I'm going to zoom out and look at the whole Mural. You'll see most of the work is hidden here. We'll do sort of a bit of progressive disclosure, and I can reveal the information as we're about to talk about it. And you're going to want to know how to zoom and pan. To pan, it's very easy. You just click in any of the white space, drag your mouse, and you'll move the Mural around. And to zoom, if you have a wheeled mouse, it's very easy. Just roll the wheel forward and you'll zoom in, or roll the wheel back and you zoom out, or you can use the plus and minus zoom buttons down here to get closer or further away. All right, you're going to do a fair amount of that, so you're going to want to know how to do that. And the other thing you're going to want to know how to do that's very simple is create sticky notes. One of the things you might want to do along the bottom here, all these circles represent each of us. And your circle, the leftmost one, the one that's not the little telephone handset, is probably you. And if you hover over that, you'll see a much simpler menu than this. But you can, for example, select Don't Show Me Cursors. You can see how everybody's cursor's floating around. It's kind of cool, but it's kind of distracting. And if you click on that, everybody's cursor will just kind of disappear. So that might be a good thing to do. All right, the other most common thing for you to do is create sticky notes. And the simplest way to create a sticky note is to simply double click on any non-movable object. Don't double click where it's hidden, because a sticky note will appear, but it'll be hidden. And as soon as you create it, you can just start typing. Okay, however you'd like to do that. And you can change the color. You can see I'll make it green. I can even change the shape. So instead of a square, I'd like it to be a rectangle or maybe a circle. Yeah, that's cool. Let's make it a circle. So let's practice that. Here's a space I'm going to reveal called mural practice. Another superpower I have is to have you look where I'm looking. And I'm going to do that right now by summoning you to this part of the mural. And if you would do me a favor and create a sticky note and put your name in it, just for you to practice creating sticky notes, change the shape, the color, that kind of thing. In fact, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and get out of your way. Good. If anybody's having any trouble, let me know. Or you can type questions in the chat window and Bogdan and Boris will help you out. Oh, Bogdan got fancy. Change the angle, very good. All right. Let's continue on. And let's talk about what we should measure. Very often when the way we begin talking about evidence-based management is that people are adopting Scrum, for example, typically Scrum. And if you have any experience with Scrum, you probably know that, oh, that wasn't locked, and it should be. If you've adopted Scrum, you know that a lot of the measures or metrics that the organization used to use when we were doing maybe waterfall development or some other approach that isn't Scrum are no longer applicable. And so management often wants to know, well, if I can't have my Gantt chart, if I'm not measuring my budget actuals or the things we used to measure, what should I measure? And my first response to that is, well, what are you trying to achieve, right? If you're measuring just for measurement's sake, it's not a very good reason. And unfortunately, as we'll talk about later, it's going to cause unintended side effects, unintended consequences. So we need to be thoughtful about what we measure. Now, one of the ways we can get down to the measures is to use models to think about different kinds of measures. And this is a common, very simple model. It's known as the Kellogg logic model, or just the logic model. And you can see it includes these categories of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and organizational results. Sometimes it's labeled impacts. And what do these different categories mean? Some of them are sort of obvious. Inputs are things we need in order to do the work. They're the money that we're able to spend, the people that are going to do the work. There may be equipment involved that's inputs, obviously computers and networks. There may be special equipment depending on what you're building or developing. And so those would be in the input category. But the stuff that we need in order to do activities. And activities are the work that the people are going to do. They're the things that we're doing on the day-to-day basis. What are we developing? What are we testing? Depending on what the solution space might be or the technology we might be using to create these solutions. And you see how little examples in there, right? So input, budget, we need that. Activities, we have test coverage. So for those of you that are in the software space, you'll understand what that means, but it could be other tasks that we perform each day. And then ultimately those activities lead to outputs, things that leave this team or maybe the company or the organization. And I show release as an example. So if you're working in software and we did a software release, we've deployed it to production, we give it to our customers, that's an output. And outputs are pretty important because we're not going to actually generate any value unless we get things out of the team doing the work. We have to get beyond the activities. And as we get outputs into the environment, they will produce outcomes. What are outcomes? Outcomes are the response of our customers or users, the people who get the output, right? How does that output affect them? And so now we're starting to focus in on the customers, the users of our results, which is where in America we say the rubber meets the road, right? This is where it's actually going to make a difference. And we need to know what the outcomes are We intend outcomes originally back when we're starting our activities, even our inputs. We're allowed to use the money and the people and the equipment and all that stuff because we believe we can achieve some particular outcome. If we don't measure the outcomes, how do we know if we've made it or not? How do we know if we achieved that intent? And as the customer experiences the outputs that we produce, the software that they're using, or maybe a marketing campaign that we have launched and they see an advertisement or a post in social media where we want them to respond and come to our website landing page to sign up for our service or our product, are they actually doing it? And as they start to be affected by our outputs, as we're realizing the outcomes, we begin to get results in the organization. Again, a lot of people call it impacts. In fact, I can't quite do that, but oh yes, I can. Hold on a second. I'm going to change it to the real language used in the Kellogg logic model. The reason we changed it sometimes is that there's something known as impact mapping. And it gets confusing for people. So if you're familiar with impact mapping, it's not what we're talking about here. So impacts are the results of the outcomes. And there are short-term impacts like we gain more customers, new customers. Or if you're working in a company that is trying to make money, you're selling products, maybe your sales go up. But there's also long-term impacts. Achieving our mission as an organization, or you could say changing the world in some way, whatever your organization is trying to achieve in the long run. So impacts can be very long run as well. I picked a short one here, short-term one called sales. So now I'd like to have you think about this a little bit. Think about your current measures in your organization, or either where you work or somewhere that you're engaged. It could be doesn't have to be work. It could be some sports team you're involved with, or social club or something like that. And I'd like you to we'll just spend a couple of minutes at this, sort of you brainstorming and recording the metrics that you currently are aware of and where they fit in this model to your best ability. I realize we only just introduced them, and so the categories may not be crystal clear yet, but this will give us something to talk about. So I'm going to set a timer for a few minutes in the mural, and I'm just going to ask you to brainstorm metrics that you pick, ones that you're actually measuring or are being measured in your area, and try to fit them into the model. We'll just spend about 3 minutes at that. Put sticky notes down that represent those different metrics for you, if you would. And I'll set a timer here for 3 minutes to just kind of help us manage the time. Remember, we're all working in the same area, so kind of make your sticky note a reasonable size, if you would. There you go. Thank you.
By the way, Mark, maybe it would make sense actually to share the screen because of the video as well.
Oh, that is an excellent idea. Let me do that.
Okay.
Okay. So you all have to shrink that screen share and get it out of the way of your mural. I'll give us a little bit more time. All right, let's spend about another 30 seconds at this and then wrap it up. And we'll chat about these. Okay, good. By the way, let's take a look at some of these because the categorization might want to, as we think about them, we can talk a little bit about it. Definitely things like requirements, the customer needs, time, absolutely. People, of course, contracts could be, yeah, those are all great impact inputs. Resources that we can use in order to enable the next stage, which is activities. Some of these other measures like lead time is probably more like activities. It could be outputs, depending on your definition of lead time. And because if it's actually measuring the output from the company, which lead time sometimes does, sometimes doesn't, depending on your definition, it's either an activity or an output. Likewise, team capacity is an input because that's the people and the time they're available for us. Velocity is a measure of the team's ability to complete work, right? So they plan some work into a sprint. The items that they completed by the end of the sprint, whatever done means for them, we count as into our velocity. And so that's actually measuring at least activity and maybe output. It would only be output if they're actually releasing that functionality to production or whatever it means to give it to customers. That would be an output. So I'll put it on the line because it kind of depends on where it is. Very good. And somebody else had velocity on here too. So again, depending on your definition of done, it's either an activity or maybe an output. Okay, so good talk about this. And if I could zoom out a little bit, yeah, as I zoom out a little bit, look at this bigger picture. Let's look at that together. Let me summon you to this view. You'll notice that there tends to be, and we only worked on this for a few minutes, right? In many organizations, there tends to be a lot of metrics on the left-hand side in the inputs and the activities, maybe the outputs, and maybe very few measures on the right-hand side. And yet the right-hand side is really what matters. Isn't that interesting? We spend so much energy measuring our activity, and maybe we're not thinking enough about the customer, the user, the environment into which we're putting this stuff. Somebody put in customer satisfaction. Thank you very much for doing that. And that could be an outcome or an impact. I'm not too concerned about whether you define it one or the other per se. Although it does depend how you actually measure it. So that's kind of an interesting thing to talk about briefly. And in in evidence-based management, we use two different words, and I want to explain the meanings of those words. We use the word measure, and we use the word metric. When we say measure, what we mean is a concept of information that that'll tell us about some particular aspect. So what do I mean? Customer satisfaction is a measure. Now, if I measure if I use a metric, is a very specific standardized way to collect the data so that it can observe trends and have transparency about that information. So if I measure customer satisfaction with a metric of Net Promoter Score, is everybody familiar with Net Promoter Score? Right? We send a survey, we ask customers, how likely are you to refer your friends, colleagues, or family to our products or service? And you rate them from 0 to 10. And then we can use a formula to collect that data and form an index, which could be from minus 100%. Nobody is likely to refer us to plus 100%. Nearly everyone is likely to refer us, very likely. And that Net Promoter Score, that is a metric because it's standardized. And we can use it to track trends over time and use it to compare this product or service to that product or service, for example, or this group of customers to a different group of customers, so they have different perspectives. But let's think about the question that we're asking in that example metric. How likely are you to refer others, right? So we're asking them about their perception of whether they might refer others. We're not asking them whether they did refer others or not, right? And if they did refer others and those people responded, that's definitely an impact, because now we have new customers. We have more customers than we had before because we made this other customer so happy. Awesome. But our Net Promoter Score doesn't tell us that. The Net Promoter Score only tells us their perception of our product or service and their opinion of whether they're likely to refer us. That might be sort of nuanced, but that implies that that particular metric is really just an outcome. It's not yet an impact. And that's why organizations also measure new customer acquisition and where it came from. You know, welcome new customer, how did you hear about us? You know, well, I found you on the internet, my buddy told me about it over a beer, or, you know, or whatever, right? Because if we have other people referring us, that's very, very powerful. It's much more powerful than if people happen to have found us, because we want our existing customers to help generate new customers. So I just want to point out the difference between a metric, which is a very specific standardized way to collect specific data, and a measure, which is more abstract. It's a concept of what we're trying to understand, like whether our customers are happy or not. How we measure it in a metric will matter, right? We have to understand what we're really measuring when we do that. Okay, very good. We're going to use these again in just a few minutes, so thank you for helping us with that. So again, this logic model of categorizing different measures or metrics, both, as inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, or impacts, can be a very powerful way to think about what are we measuring today and where are we not measuring? Are we measuring outcomes? And if we're not, oh my gosh, why not? Because that's where it starts to actually matter. No value is created until we've started to achieve an outcome. That's a really important concept. Working hard, we all appreciate the hard work that we have, but in and of itself isn't value yet. Somebody has to get benefit out of that work for it to be valuable. Probably makes sense for everybody. Okay. So now let's think about this idea of what are you trying to achieve? Remember, I asked that question before, and here's a little paraphrased quote. My apologies to the author, Lewis Carroll, from Alice in Wonderland. If you don't know where you're going, any measure will get you there. He was talking about roads, but we'll talk about measures, right? In other words, we've got to know the goal. What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to grow the business? In other words, achieve an impact of increased market share? Or are we trying to improve our customers' happiness with our product or service, which is either an outcome or an impact of increased customer satisfaction, however we decide to measure that? Maybe our goal is to improve the quality in order to achieve higher customer satisfaction, but the focus is on quality, okay, which is maybe an output, really. So if we have defects that our customers are finding and they're in large number, that's likely to have an outcome. It's a negative outcome, right? It's unlikely customers will view us favorably if we're giving them buggy stuff. And so we have to know what we're trying to achieve, and that will help us understand what we should measure. First, we should measure what we're trying to achieve. So if we want higher quality, and that's an important goal for us, then we should measure our quality. But more than that, we'll also have to look at what behaviors we need, what activities we should be performing that are likely to lead to higher quality. That make sense? If all we do is measure the quality, it's sort of too late, if you will, right? That's what we call a lagging indicator. We'll talk about that some more. But if we only measure the quality of the product in, let's say, defects found by customers or problems reported by customers, we won't know what the results are until we actually take the measurement. And now it's too late in a sense. I mean, we still have the future, but whatever we've done is resulted in the current measure. So we're going to need to also measure what we believe will help us achieve that higher level of quality. Maybe, well, I'm going to use software examples. I hope that works for most people because that's kind of where my background is. But obviously, maybe if we're creating a lot of defects, we need to code in new ways that creates fewer defects to begin with. And maybe we need to test in new ways that is better at finding or preventing defects from ever escaping from the development activity, or all of those things, and maybe many other things too. And which of the ones for us in our specific context will be most important? Now we'll get into the idea of a hypothesis in a little bit, because we're making assumptions about what we think will make it better. And we'll be better off if we approach that as a hypothesis and an experiment, as opposed to believing we understand all the causes and effects, which in a complex environment, for example, where we would use Scrum to solve complex problems, the cause and effect relationship isn't well understood, perhaps even unknown. All right, so let's talk about this idea of the goal. What are we trying to achieve? And let me give you an example here that you've probably heard about. I expect most people have around the world. In 1961, then United States President John Kennedy gave a speech to the government, the Congress of the United States, where he made this quote. Okay, right. Let's get a man to the moon and back safely again by the end of the 1960s, by the end of the decade. That's a pretty audacious goal. We often use this word audacious or ambitious or wildly important or big and hairy. That's a phrase that some people use. And there are different authors that use those different phrases. And it doesn't really matter. The point is that the goal is really complex. Okay, and evidence-based management is geared toward achieving complex goals. Just like Scrum is geared towards solving complex problems that we have, like producing a new product, EBM is geared toward achieving really complex, ambitious goals where we may not know how to achieve it. Thinking back, way back, almost 60 years ago to 1961, wow. The thought of putting a man on a rocket to go to the moon was pretty ambitious because most rockets exploded on the launch pad. The thought of putting a human being in one of those things was pretty frightening. And so that goal, which is very specific, right? We're clear about what we want to do. A human being from the Earth to the moon and back again safely, alive. That's very specific. It's also measurable. In this case, it's like true, false. Yes or no, did we do it or not? It's binary. It's certainly audacious, or you could use ambitious for the A part. You might notice that acronym of specific or measurable, audacious, and time-bound as the SMART acronym. The R part would be realizable, meaning as far as we know, it doesn't violate the laws of the universe, right? It may be a little bit unclear in the case of the moonshot back in 1961, but I think we understood physics well enough to know that that was definitely realizable. Now that goal was so ambitious and so audacious, we had to have intermediate goals, right? It wasn't, if we just waited until December 31st of 1969 to test, to measure whether we got to the moon or back, it's too late, right? Because tomorrow is the 1970s, it's too late now. Instead, we needed to think about what are the leading indicators that would tell us whether we're likely to make it. And in fact, getting to the moon was so audacious, we need some intermediate goals, like reliable rockets that would launch without exploding, or at least hardly ever. But then maybe another goal, once we have rockets that we can launch reliably, we're unsure what the effect will be on a living organism. So maybe we should launch something that's not human, right? Because the risk for that is a little higher than we're willing to tolerate. And of course, in the Soviet Union, they launched a dog. And in America, we launched a chimpanzee just to see what were the effects on this living organism to see if, to try to ameliorate that risk. And then could we launch a human just off and recover them safely? Then could they orbit the Earth? Then could we get to the moon and back without landing? Because now we're having to spend many days in this launch vehicle, this rocket. And progressively achieving each of these intermediate goals, each of which was audacious in and of itself, but on a path to get from where we were, where virtually all rockets are exploding and no way would put a living being on it, to the point where we could actually get to the moon, land on the moon, and return again safely. So this is the kind of goal that we're talking about. Now, your goals may not be quite this ambitious or quite this audacious, and that's okay. But I bet you have goals for you personally or for your organization that we don't know how to achieve it. We think it's achievable, but we don't know how to get there. Maybe you're trying to grow revenue by 10x, 10 times. That's really ambitious. Maybe you're trying to find a new product for new customers. That's also very ambitious. But whatever that goal is for you, we're talking about those types of goals. Now, there are other types of goals that you have. If I were in the sales organization, I might have a goal today to call 10 customers. That's a goal. But I wouldn't put it in the ambitious, audacious category, right? We know how to do that. I have to pick up the phone. I have to call people. I have to talk to them, okay? Whether that's a good goal or not is also a different question. Maybe I should be, instead of calling 10 people, maybe my goal should be to close one sale today, right? We have to understand whether it's a good goal or not. But both of those examples are not that complex goal we're talking about. I don't need evidence-based management for that. So that's a part of it that we should think about. Is this a case where evidence-based management will be useful? Now, there's another way to think about measures, and we'll take a look at this model. And I'll refer it to you now verbally, and then later on we can point you to it specifically. There's, just like there's a guide for Scrum that many of you may be familiar with, there's a guide for evidence-based management, published by scrum.org in this case. And in fact, you can go to the scrum.org website and simply search for EBM guide, and you'll be able to find it pretty easily. And in that guide, it describes what I'm beginning to talk about here, and I will flesh out some more for you. And it also talks about a categorization of metrics that's a little bit different than we just talked about. We talked about the Kellogg logic model, inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. This model is what we call key value areas. So we're zeroing in on what is value, which is crucial from an agile practice perspective, right? If you're familiar with Scrum, you know that we talk about the product backlog, and we talk about those items on the product backlog being valuable to our stakeholders, hopefully customers or users, but somebody. And here, this categorization focuses in on the value aspect. Now, on the top half of this diagram, which for some reason doesn't show up in this graphic, is the external focus or the market focus. And that's the current value. So this is, what is our organizational, our company, or maybe it's our group, our department, whatever, the service or products that we deliver, what is the current value delivered by this organization? And if it's out to customers in the marketplace, we might be able to measure current value by things like revenue or market share, things that we kind of talked about already. That's interesting. But in addition to the current value that the organization is currently realizing, there's the unrealized value. This is the opportunity for us, right? It's value that we are not yet realizing, but is available out there. Now, we're not realizing unrealized value, but somebody else could be, because in the marketplace where we're offering a product or a service, we have competitors, right? And competitors have acquired some of our possible customers, darn it. And those potential customers that are now somebody else's customers are part of the unrealized value. And there may be potential customers that nobody has captured yet. Well, why not us? But we haven't yet. So that's the aspect of unrealized value. So there's a total amount of value out there, which is the top half of this diagram. Some of it we're capturing, some of it we are not, more or less. And what we'd like to talk about is moving value from unrealized value into our current value. What will it take for us to do that? That would be an ambitious goal, potentially. Now, in the bottom half is more of our organizational capability. That is to say, how we operate to create the current value, which implies changes we might want to make in order to capture unrealized value. And there's two categories. There's time to market. How long does it take us to create value? And our ability to innovate, meaning this organization's ability to create valuable things. So there's the creation of valuable things and the time it takes to create valuable things. And that's our current capability. Okay, so these are the key value areas that we talk about as one way to think about measures or evidence in evidence-based management. So let's think about that for a moment. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to copy all of the measures that you brainstormed a little while ago, and I'm going to create a copy of those and move them down here into the space labeled current measures. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Again, a bit of activity for you. Find measures that are now in that copy space that you created and see if you can think about what category, what key value area they might fit into. Okay, for example, budget, where does that fit? Well, I'm not sure. Maybe that's part of our ability to innovate, because if I don't have any budget, I can't create new things. And again, we may find some ambiguity in the definition or where these measures fit in, and that's okay. And if you can't find a place for them, just leave them over there on the right-hand side, and that's okay. But go ahead, select the measures that you created, see if you can think about where they might fit on the key value areas. And I'll put a timer here for a few minutes just to kind of drive us to affect those. I created a few metrics too, so I'm going to do that too. Oh, it looks like we're getting most of them categorized. That's great. All right, good. I'm going to violate my rules and stop the time box early, but hopefully you're okay with that. Good. In fact, this is one that I created, so sales would be up here. Needs, wants, availability, resources, current state. Well, this is sort of a multitude of things, so I can understand why it was difficult to categorize that. Okay, so you can see that there is a way to think about these in a different way, although the fit isn't perfect. Let's come back to one of the things that I added, but I don't think I mentioned. We did talk about customer satisfaction, which we did categorize up in the current value, I think is the right way to think about that. Another aspect which was in that impact category was employee engagement. And I should have talked about that earlier, but let's chat about it now. What do we mean by that? Well, obviously we're trying to get the people who are doing the work, the activities, creating the innovation, and how long it takes them to do that. We need people in our company that are really engaged, right? That really want to come to work, that are excited about it. If my motivation to come to work is to collect my paycheck, and that's the only reason I'm showing up, that's a very low level of engagement, isn't it? And I'm not sure what it is where you are, but I know so there's been a lot of research on employee engagement, and it turns out that only about 1/3 of employees, and I believe this is worldwide, are actively engaged in their work. Unfortunately, about a third of those other 2/3 are actively disengaged, meaning they're not even showing up potentially. I don't know, they're surfing the internet all day or something, not clear. So if we want to solve complex problems or achieve complex goals, we're going to need people who really want to try this out, because it's hard work, isn't it? I'm sure you have experience with this. And I'm going to have to want to try this out because, boy, everything is difficult. And if I want to get results, then I got to have people who are engaged. Now you'll notice in the KVAs, I put it on the line. I moved that one. I put it on the line because I could argue that we need engaged employees to create innovative ideas and try them out. And that's true. But I also need our employees to be really engaged so that we can find the innovations that will work in a timely manner. Right? If it takes us too long, our competitors are going to beat us in the marketplace. And that's not going to really enable us to achieve those complex goals. Okay, so another way of thinking about measures and metrics, and we can use both of them. What's often true, and I'm not necessarily trying to move these around to correct them like I did with the logic model so much. For example, the release burn down, I can see how we might think it's unrealized value, although I might also say maybe it's closer down to when we're going to get things. That's often why we would have a burn down chart to talk about when the work will be completed. I don't know. It's a little bit ambiguous, and that's okay. As long as we're having the dialogue about what these measures mean, that's probably more important than putting it in the right place. So all of these categorization models, the logic model we looked at first and the KVA model we're looking at now, don't worry about whether it's the right category. Just worry about talking about these measures and trying to identify where we may be missing measures. And although there's a few measures on unrealized value, you can see there aren't very many there. And that's pretty common. Thinking about unrealized value and measuring it is not easy to do and maybe uncommon in your organization. So there's an area where we might be more thoughtful. Just looking at the diagram at face value, just accepting where they were put and not questioning them, it looks like we've got quite a few measures around ability to innovate and maybe fewer around time to market. So if that were true for your organization, we might want to think about, are we really thinking about how long it takes us to do this stuff and what that means for us and its consequence? I don't know whether we should be faster or not, but if we're not talking about it, I guarantee we never will, except by accident, which we probably don't want to rely on just luck. Luck is good, but it's not enough. All right, let's take another concept here of which I mentioned, this idea of leading and lagging indicators. And one of the reasons we use the logic model is that there's this sense that one thing leads to another. I have to have inputs to enable activities. I have to do work, activities to produce outputs. I have to have outputs for our customers to have an experience in which we can achieve outcomes. And I need those outcomes to get that longer range. You notice it's still labeled organizational results or impacts. Remember, I changed the label. So this idea of some of our measures might be leading indicators to other measures, which would be lagging indicators to the leading indicator, but it's all relative. So any measure could be both a leading indicator to something else or a lagging indicator to something that came before. Okay. Now the problem is I can't tell you that every input is a leading indicator to every activity measure and that every activity measure is a leading indicator to every output. It's simply not true. What we need to do is try to find the leading indicators for the lagging indicators that are important to us. And for evidence-based management, the goals that we talked about need to be those audacious or ambitious goals. We want those to be outcomes or organizational results, right? It's not enough to have an ambitious goal in activities because we're not getting value yet. We can only get value once we start to realize outcomes and impacts. So our evidence-based management goal, this big audacious goal that we're talking about, is going to be an outcome or an impact if it's well-formed. And it always involves some kind of behavior change, right? An outcome means the customer is able to do something they couldn't do before. Maybe they're able to perform a task they couldn't do before. Maybe they're able to purchase something they couldn't do before. Maybe they're able to communicate with you in a way they couldn't before. But that helps to engender new behaviors. And that's the only way we can achieve impact, is that people behave differently. The challenge with behaviors is that they're hard to measure. Sometimes they're harder than other times, depending on what the behavior is. But that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. Lagging indicators, for example, measuring the goal itself, are usually pretty straightforward, right? Like the get a man to the moon and safely back again by the end of the decade. Well, did we or not? That's pretty obvious. We can measure it. It's very explicit. The leading indicators that are likely to tell us if we might get to there are hard to identify because cause and effect are uncertain, and because they often involve people's behaviors that can be very difficult to measure. So finding the leading indicators is quite difficult. And so I have to be honest, it's an art form. I wish I could tell you there was science. It's really not science, it's more art. So we're going to try things out to see if it will help make progress toward that ultimate goal, the lagging indicator. And sometimes we'll be right, and we'll celebrate that, and we can continue to measure. And sometimes we'll be wrong. We'll try to search for something else. So let's come back to our example of we need to improve quality in our customers' experience. And that would be an outcome measure, perhaps. And we said maybe some of the activities that would have to be different is maybe we need, if it were a software product, we'd have to code differently. And now think about that. That's strictly a behavior. How are we going to measure the way people are coding? Well, maybe there are ways. We could see if people are pair programming, for example, or working together instead of working independently. Or maybe we're not working together yet, but we're going to do a code review to try to improve just the quality of the code before we integrate it into the rest of the product. Are we doing peer reviews or not? And if we believe that would lead to higher quality in the customer experience, then we are hypothesizing that that's a leading indicator. That would be one example. And another thing we think we have to do is that maybe we should test differently. In fact, maybe we should write the test before they ever write the code. You might be familiar with test first development, or just test first, a lot of people call it. And I apologize for the software example if you're not in the software space. But the idea is, let's be crystal clear about exactly how we're going to verify that the product is correct before we go create the product. And traditionally in the software world, we would code it first and then try to test it. And it's easy to miss things when you work that way. But if we create the test first, now the people that are doing the programming know exactly what's expected of them, precisely. And they can create just enough code to make the test pass. And we have plenty of evidence and experience that tells us we produce much higher quality product when we work that way. Well, how would we measure that? Could we measure that we've created the test first? You can imagine that we might be able to measure that, but again, it's around people's behaviors. All right, so the idea of leading and lagging indicators is quite important because we can't wait till the end, our time-bound goal, to determine whether we were successful or not, because we can't take any corrective action. But if people are not doing their peer reviews or not creating the test before we create the code, we could start to talk to people about whether they've tried that, if they need some training, maybe they need some new skills, which could be training or just mentoring and coaching. Maybe they don't have the tools to do that method properly. And we could start to work with them to gain new skills or use new tools to see if peer reviews and test first development actually produces higher quality from a customer experience perspective. And along this time, we should be measuring the customer's quality experience, but we wouldn't expect the change to occur instantaneously just because we want it to. We're going to have to start working differently. Okay, now, this leads to another important effort that I did also mention, and let me summon you to the mural where I'm looking right now. Of course, you can see it on the screen share, I realize that. And that's the idea of the observer effect. This is the notion that we will modify our behavior whenever we are aware that we're being measured. And remember what I just said, all the leading indicators are about behavior to begin with. So when people know they're being measured, they're likely to change their behavior, even if we're not using the measure to judge them, meaning to use it, let's say, against them, right? Just being aware that we're being measured, we will make assumptions about why we're being measured, and we will try to affect that reason why that we have assumed. So we have to be very careful about the observer effect, because we're talking about collecting evidence here, which means people will change their behavior, and we don't necessarily want unintended consequences. So you can see at the bottom, there's a few examples there that are probably obvious to you. Maybe you've experienced it yourself. For example, if we were measured the lead time, now this is actually stated more as a goal than a measure, because we have the word reduce. So that says we're trying to achieve something. But if we are measuring lead time, which is the time from when we start the work until we deliver it to users, some people call it cycle time, by the way. So we can consider it interchangeable for our purposes. The people that notice we're measuring lead time might say, well, they must want us to be faster. So let's skip some steps. We don't really need to do that test. That's good enough. Let's just get it to the customer. That'll shrink our lead time. And it will, but that's not what we wanted. And so we probably need to balance that quantitative measure of how long it takes with a qualitative measure, in this case, the resulting quality of the product. It's not okay for us to skip steps, right? We don't want people to not do the definition of done, for example. That's not good enough. And you can see the other examples here, experiences I've had in my own life where we measure sales, and people that produce sales might think, well, we probably have to grow sales. The problem is we might well sell easy stuff to sell that has low margin. That is to say, the profit is small. And yeah, our sales go up, but our profitability could go down. And if a for-profit company, that may not be good. So maybe we have to balance that measure with what kinds of products we're selling. You can see the example that we have here, et cetera. So whenever we create a measure, particularly a quantitative measure, we may need to balance it with a qualitative measure to try to avoid possible unintended consequences. Something to think about as we create measures in the organization. All right, now I'd like to put it together into a little diagram of one way to think about evidence-based management. And we're going to get to the diagram in just a moment. Let's see, should we do this? Yeah, let's try this out. Again, a little exercise here. Let's imagine that we had a goal, and our goal is to be the highest rated user experience for our product category. It's a little generic because whatever your product is, but you can imagine. And in our particular product category, let's imagine that CNET, you're maybe familiar with CNET, that's an independent organization that reviews products and rates products, mostly soft products, products on the internet, things like that. We're going to use this independent organization's measure of user experience, and CNET actually measures that. So we could use that as our goal indicator, our goal metric, because our goal is highest rated user experience. So what's our metric? User experience rating. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? The question is, what might be leading indicators? What things might we measure now to determine whether we're likely to achieve the highest rated user experience as measured by CNET? So I'm going to ask you to brainstorm that for just a minute. This might not be your domain, but you're probably familiar with internet products like Amazon.com or eBay or social media, things like that, and how easy it is to use those products. So you can use your imagination just from your own experience. What might we measure that could be leading indicators to achieving that highest rated experience? So I'd ask you to, in the mural now, not in my shared screen, of course, if you could create sticky notes, just kind of brainstorm sticky notes that would represent possible leading indicators. Let's just spend a couple minutes thinking about that. guys are doing a great job. Let's try to wrap it up in about 10 seconds here. Okay, you get the idea. Yeah. Now, all of these are great ideas. Which ones are good? Which ones are right? I don't know. Neither do any of us. And so all of these are hypotheses about things that we could measure that are about behaviors of various kinds of people. It could be our own employees' behavior. For example, I added one of time to respond to customer requests. Okay, so customer want to change, how long does it take us to respond? That's our own behavior. Or another one, positive reviews on the App Store or Google Play. Well, that's a customer's behavior. And if they're giving us positive reviews, maybe they like us. Okay, does that mean that we have a great user experience? I'm not sure. So all of these are hypotheses, and what we're going to want to do is try to pick a few and use them as potential candidates as leading indicators and actively measure them so we could try to understand the relationship between these ideas and our ultimate goal of the highest rated user experience. Okay, so this gets to be really challenging, right? Because there's not a lot of certainty here, but that's the nature of complex problems. And that's why we're going to use empiricism to figure that out. Mark, so let's talk about, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question about this panel, or should I leave that for the end?
Go ahead and ask now.
Okay, so when we wrote here measure user experience rating by CNET, so why is that a measure? And when we talked about specific metric like net promoter score, that's metric and this is measure. So I imagined like measure, as you said, as a concept, as a construct, and this seems very specific for a concept. So let me what's the difference?
You caught me. I made an error. This is, by the definition I said, thank you for catching that. This actually is a metric because it's standardized and we can use it to compare trends and of one product versus another product. No, you got it exactly right.
Okay.
Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, very good. Good catch. You get a free cup of coffee. Well, it's probably too late for you for that, but maybe not. Let's talk about how to use these measures in order to achieve these really ambitious goals. So we're going to take a look at this little visualization, a model of thinking about evidence-based management as an improvement framework. And if you're following along in the mural, I'll summon you to this space. So this is an empirical method. Okay, again, empiricism fits to solve in a complex space. So we have this goal that's very audacious, it's very ambitious. And you can see in this diagram, we're measuring that goal with a vertical axis. So there's some measure of the goal. We've talked about that a little bit already. And it is a metric, to Mario's point, that should be specific and repeatable and standardized. It can take some work to get to that too, right? So when we first started talking about this, it may just be a measure, but we'll have to get to a metric. And then on the horizontal axis is simply time. And we're in a current state. However we got there, there's some path we took to get there. And it may have been accidental or it may have been purposeful, but we are where we are in regards to the goal and the measure of that goal or metric of that goal. Now, in some cases, the goal is so ambitious, it's so difficult, we may choose to have a next target, or we also say intermediate goal, which in and of itself is probably ambitious. That is to say, it's complex. Okay, and I gave you the moon mission examples of intermediate goals. So that would be here. Now we consider next targets or intermediate goals to be optional. They may not be necessary. So it's a judgment call. Do we need something that will, is a stepping stone on the way? Because either the distance from our current state metric and the goal metric is so great, we just have no idea how to achieve that. Or maybe in time, that the goal encompasses so much time that we'd like to have some wins along the way, some successes along the way, and it's worth creating intermediate goals. But in some cases, it's not necessary, then you don't need that, and that's okay too. Now, just to elaborate this diagram a little bit, I'm going to move to another place in the mural. Those little circles along our path are represented by that experiment loop on the left-hand side of this part of the diagram. And the experiment loop, you can see, consists of a hypothesis. And we've already talked about this, right? We believe that using peer reviews is one factor that will help us improve our customer quality experience. But we don't know that that's true, and so we need to perform an experiment. So let's try it out. Maybe just one team tries it out for the first time, or maybe our hypothesis is pair programming, right? Or test first development, as I mentioned. And we might have multiple steps that we're going to take, multiple experiments that we're going to perform as leading indicators, all in pursuit of our goal of superior customer quality experience. Excuse me. When we perform the experiment, it's important that we measure the results of that experiment. And this would be both the leading indicator, did we do the peer review, or how well did we do the peer review, right? It's not necessarily binary. Because if you've ever done a peer review, you know that typically the reviewers find issues, or you may call them findings or observations or issues or defects or whatever you call them. How effective was the peer review? That might be important also. And then from that measure, the data, which ultimately does have to be a metric, Mario, before you catch me, because that probably is, maybe our language wasn't very precise here, as precise as it should be. Using the data we collect, the evidence, what are we going to do with it? Inspect and adapt. Did it actually improve the quality so that customers may at least eventually experience improved quality, or not? Or we did it and it was good, but we think it could be better. So we kind of end up with three options, right? Hey, we're on the right track. We should continue on that path and really push forward with this. Maybe now let's get more teams to do the pair programming or the peer review. Or, well, we got some good results, but I think we need to make an adjustment, right? Instead of having all these people spend hours to find two issues in our environment, maybe we just need one person to review and see what they can find. Let's try that as a new experiment to see if we get better results with that before we try to expand. So adjust what we're doing. Or we might decide, you know, this is not working. Yeah, we're doing the peer reviews and they're finding things, but they're not finding things that will ultimately affect the customer's quality experience. So maybe it's still a good thing to do, but it's not helping us achieve that goal. So we need to try something else. So let's abandon this approach and create a new hypothesis about how we could start to make progress toward that goal.
Mark, sorry, one intermediate question here. Like, how long do you stick to that hypothesis? That's a really like something tricky in practice, because stick for it too long and you're basically beating the dead horse. Stick for it too short and you're not doing it actually.
That's actually an awesome question, because yeah, you're right. When we first try to do something new, you probably all had this experience, right? The first time you tried to play a musical instrument, you probably weren't very good. You know what I mean? And you had to practice over and over again to gain any ability at all. In the case of a musical instrument, literally any ability. In your professional work, when we're trying something new, it's probably an adjustment to what you're already doing. And so you may get some benefit right away, and it may not be as good as it can be if we continue to practice some more, right? To your point, Bogdan. So you've asked an excellent question, and I wish I could give you like a fixed answer, but in fact, it's a judgment call. So together as a group that's trying this experiment, we just need to be open and honest with each other about whether we think it has potential or not. And so there's that are you seeing any glimmer of progress? If you are, let's try it another time. Let's give it another chance. If you're really seeing no glimmer, in fact, if your measure shows that you've made it worse, you probably want to try something else, but it's a judgment call. Good question. Now, there's another thing I'd like to add that's not in this diagram, but if you download the evidence-based management guide that I mentioned, You'll see it in this diagram, I think we've changed some of the verbiage slightly in the diagram, but the goal itself is a hypothesis. It's so ambitious, so audacious, so difficult to achieve. I mean, we're having to use empiricism to try to achieve it, right? So the goal itself is a hypothesis, and we might have to modify the goal. As we start to try to make progress toward that goal, we might identify that the goal is not quite right. And we have to make adjustments, either in the time frame or the measure or even what the goal is. Or we might discover that it's actually not a good goal and we should abandon this goal and focus on something else. And we need to do that. And some of you might be familiar with the term double loop learning. So evidence-based management employs double loop learning. Not only are we going to learn about the specific hypothesis that we're learning about through experimentation, but we'll learn more about the goal itself. And not only will we adjust our hypothesis, we may have to adjust the goal. So that's the two loops going on. And back to Bogdan, you can ask your question again related to the goal. How long do you wait before you decide to make adjustments? And it's a judgment call. In general, you're going to make adjustments to your hypothesis fairly rapidly. We'd like our experiments to take short periods of time, maybe days at most, perhaps hours. The goal is almost certainly weeks, months, or longer than that. And so we would expect to pursue it for longer before we would adjust or abandon that goal. And in practice, what are you going to do? And we have this idea in evidence-based management of a cadence of accountability, or what actually we now call it the EBM review. And it's sort of the parallel of a sprint review. You notice we don't have nearly as much structure in EBM as we do in Scrum. We don't talk about a backlog of goals. Look, how many ambitious goals can you really achieve and focus on? Not very many. 2 maybe. Maybe you should just do 1, You really have to focus your energy. And one of the reasons for that is this diagram, the idea of the whirlwind, right? Your business as usual activity consumes almost all your effort. In fact, if you let it, it will consume not only all your effort, but more, right? How many of you have too much to do? Can probably all raise our hands. So the last thing I need is yet another thing like this ambitious goal, right? Because guess what? All my business as usual is still there. How are we going to carve out enough time to pursue this really difficult, complex thing? It's hard to do. And one of the ways we can overcome the whirlwind is to force ourselves to do it through an event like cadence of accountability, or as we now say, EBM review. What does the EBM review look like? Well, first of all, it should be fairly frequent, like weekly, to kind of force us to go through that experiment loop, to form hypotheses, to carry out the experiment, to measure the results, and then inspect and adapt about what we should do about it. And so every week, let's get together, a short period, maybe half an hour, perhaps, to talk about what experiments have we tried since last week, what measures, what new evidence have we collected, and therefore, empirically, what should we work on next? What new hypotheses might we create that we can commit to experimenting with between now and next week when we meet again? So this idea of the EBM review, or the cadence of accountability, forcing us to set aside time and commit to each other as a team about what we're going to try to make progress toward that really difficult, complex, audacious goal, is one of the techniques we can use in order to actually force ourselves to make progress. Okay, so think about this practical aspect of getting together as the group, doing the work toward the goal to talk about where we are and what we're going to do next. So that's sort of like the sprint review. You could say it's sort of like the daily Scrum. I don't think you want to do this every day. I think you want to do this relatively frequently. I think once a month is too long, because what will happen is you'll wait until that last day of the month and say, oh gosh, I was supposed to do some experiments. Well, let me try something really fast, or you just don't do it at all. So the weekly cadence, I think, is a good driving force. All right, well, that's about the end of my talk. Thank you for your questions, and we have time for more Q&A. I do want to point you to a free open assessment for EBM, the Professional Agile Leadership EBM Open Assessment, and there's a link there to it if you choose. And I'll paste a link in the chat window here for the EBM guide, or Or maybe while I'm answering questions, maybe Bogdan or Boris could find that and paste it in the chat window if you haven't already. So I'd like to just open it for questions that you might have. Mario, the Hawthorne effect is correct, although Hawthorne has been discredited in some circles, and so we tend to shy away from that term. But
yeah, well, it was first coined because of Hawthorne studies in light plant. So yeah,
that's right.
it's also
That's
known
right.
as that.
Yes, that's correct. Any other questions about EBM?
In the beginning, Bogdan said about you that you're very familiar with working with Kanban and Kanban Metrics, and maybe yourself you're some kind of Kanban guru. I don't know how you clarify about that, but do you see any connection with the EBM? Personally, I do practice Kanban within my teams, but this is the first time I have experienced this kind of metrics and measurements. This is very interesting for me, but I have to say that I haven't read the guide. But can you maybe clarify some kind of connections? And for example, I'm very familiar with Kanban metrics,
Great. So you're familiar with, of course, cycle time and WIP,
yeah,
and
WIP
throughput.
limits, average WIP limits. I'm measuring them, and we are measuring throughputs. We are tracking,
Yes.
cycle time histograms, throughput histograms. In Kanban teams, we have some kind of consistency. We have mature teams, and we have that historical data. We have
Yes.
some, improvements.
Good.
But
That's great.
maybe.
Yes, and those measures, but it can be quite powerful. One of the things that Kanban gives us is we're measuring something specific, like time or number of items, which is very different than the Scrum world where we have these arbitrary unitless points. You don't have to do that in Scrum, but a lot of people do. And the problem with points or the resulting velocity, for those of you familiar with that term, is that it's not clear that statistical analysis of points and velocity is valid because they're unitless and they're ambiguous. And I don't know that they have any sense of accuracy or precision. But measuring time does, right? Here's when we started, here's where we ended, right? We can talk about accuracy and precision. And we can gain a lot of knowledge from statistical analysis of cycle time and WIP and things like that. Linking it back to our logic model that we talked about earlier, and I was kind of zoomed into that area of the mural here on the screen. The Kanban metrics can be very powerful, but they also have some limits. They tend to measure activities and outputs, and that's all. And so we'll need to supplement those measures, which are very powerful and can be leading indicators to other outcomes and impacts that we really want to achieve. But we'll have to supplement the Kanban metrics with those outcome metrics and impact metrics.
Yeah. The only reason I can see that in this field of outputs is measuring trend through time and seeing whether we are going to progress the goal toward the goal, whether we are improving, whether you said earlier, are we on the correct path or we should change some kind of things. But so the idea is thinking on outcomes and impacts. And yes. Yeah, this is great advice. Thank you.
Yeah. And we have the same challenge in the Scrum world, by the way, because if you're using points to estimate and using velocity to talk about the items the team completed, it's very similar to the throughput measure in Kanban. I mean, there are differences, but at least to the first order, we could talk about velocity is sort of like a throughput. It's weighted throughput because we're measuring the relative amount of work and items, but it isn't a measure of value. And value is what matters from an outcome perspective. So in both of those worlds, we also need to find ways to talk about the most valuable things, what value have we delivered, and how do we know it's valuable? Because it's started to affect the customer and the user. And is that effect positive or unfortunately perhaps negative? And measuring the trends of the actual outcome for the customer. So those are additional things we want to be thoughtful about.
Mark, we also have a question in chat by Gil. Thoughts on how to cultivate EBM way of thinking and working when often the HIPPO method prevails?
Right, good. And everybody probably knows HIPPO is the highest paid person's opinion. We usually recommend for my clients, when I work with my clients, I just say, look, if there's an area of the organization that's interested in using EBM to help achieve goals, and they understand the empiricism, let's just get started. We don't have to do it everywhere. We just want to try to start doing it somewhere. Now, if the organization is using Scrum and they have any kind of, let me say, maturity in Scrum, they're beyond just using the words of Scrum. They're actually, beginning to realize benefit and they understand the mindset. Then they're beginning to understand empiricism. And for example, managers of Scrum teams, if they're starting to get it, then we could say, well, how could we use this for your group, your department, your team, or your portion of the company? And you may not want to have a product backlog with a product owner, because we're talking about the organization now, and it kind of doesn't match very well. But EBM doesn't have those words, and it's focused really, ultimately, if you think about what we've been talking about, is really about changing the organization, organizational change. And that's what we're going to have to do to achieve these goals. So for your department, Ms. Manager or Mr. Manager, we might be able to use this idea of empiricism. I could almost say like lightweight Scrum. I don't have any defined roles and I don't particularly have any defined artifacts. In fact, there's only one event, and that's the review periodically to force us to actually take action. But we could start to measure and take action here at the local level. And if you have success at the local level, maybe others would be interested, either in maybe a colleague of this manager in a peer organization, or maybe perhaps higher levels in the organization or even lower levels in the organization. So our guidance usually is get started somewhere in a small way. Learn what will work for you in your organization, because just like adopting any agile practice, like in Kanban, you've got to define your workflow, and that's very unique and specific to your team. Or in Scrum, although we have a framework to use, how you plan and how you do the work, Scrum doesn't say that, doesn't tell you how to do that. You have to discover that. And so for evidence-based management, it's the same challenge. There's a framework here, but how you're going to actually make it work in your organization, you're going to have to discover along the way. So the best way to do that is to start trying it out. So let's start, but just in a very small, narrow way. And if we get success, we can talk about how to get others to do it. And if you're in an organization where there's a hippo that wants to make all the decisions, I wouldn't start there. I would go somewhere else, because the team is really it's the same issue in any agile practice. We need an empowered team that can experiment, try things out that may not work, and then be able to say, okay, that didn't work, that failed, let's not do it that way, let's try something else. And if the team's not empowered to learn about that, you really can't do empirical approaches. Great questions.
I would like to ask you, if you can help me compare this to another model. The model that I like to use for solutions, just finding solutions or conflict resolution, is I split it into three things. One is observe the evidence, and that translates nicely to the EBM. And then the second one is I make inferences based on the evidence.
Yes.
And then the third one is I explain the impact it has. Now, here we have hypothesis about possible impact or outcomes, right? But right. I'm missing the mid layer. I'm trying to find the connection, and it may not translate fully, but if you could share opinion about that.
It does map, I believe, and if you're familiar with the OODA loop, OODA, that's another variation on a theme that you're talking about. Orient, observed, etc. The inspect and adapt part of the experiment loop is very much where the inference would occur, because we have a hypothesis of what will cause change toward a specific goal, right? Almost certainly the experiment will cause some change, but it may not help us achieve the goal. Although it might not affect a change, so that could be a problem. So the inference part would be in the analysis we're doing of the results.
Right, the context, because we're putting the results into a context, right?
Exactly. And in particular, the context is the lagging and leading indicators. One thing I failed to mention is that in addition to the evidence-based management review, or that kinds of accountability, we don't consider it required, but most groups adopt an evidence dashboard where we have the goal and the goal measure, and we have the leading indicators underneath it with those leading measures. And at this EBM review every week, we're looking at that dashboard to talk about what's actually happened and what we want to do next. And so in terms of making the inference and making decisions about what to do, the inspect and adapt part of it, let's help ourselves know what's going on by having the concrete evidence, and where we can look at the trends, we can visualize the measures if that's important, usually is, so that we all have a common understanding of where we are, what is our current state. And the dashboard should represent the current state. So I hope that helped a little.
Yeah, thanks.
OKRs, yes, I see OKRs as a question. OKRs are an outstanding way to talk about the goal and the lagging and leading indicators. And it's totally compatible with evidence-based management. So OKRs is a very common approach for describing the goals and identifying leading indicators. But there are other models too. In fact, evidence-based management is a combination, a synthesis of 3 models out there. You could say it includes other submodels like the OODA loop or plan, do, check, adapt, if you're familiar with PDCA. But the 3 big models, the improvement models, are OKRs is one of them. So if you know about OKRs, we consider ourselves to be compatible with that. What we've added is the empiricism, the experiment loop, which OKRs don't explicitly talk about, and we do. So I'm not saying we're better than OKRs. I'm saying we believe we complement OKRs. Another model that's also similar and complementary is the 4 disciplines of execution. And this is work by McChesney and Covey and Hewling. And it's a book, 4 Disciplines of Execution, and there's web material around this. If you've ever heard of a wildly important goal, that comes from the 4 Disciplines of Execution. And they talk also about lagging and leading indicators. And they talk about, this is where the phrase cadence of accountability comes, is forcing us to take action. And the third model that's synthesized into this, which is where the empirical part comes from, is what's known as the Improvement Kata. This is work by Mike Rother at the University of Michigan. And he's done a lot of work at Toyota. He's more of a person in the lean community, focusing on lean manufacturing. But he's worked with Toyota for many years, understanding how they've been able to achieve what they've been able to achieve, the largest car manufacturer in the world. And he's learned how to describe what they do to the rest of us so that we might be able to achieve some of that greatness too in our own worlds, our own domains. And what he calls the Improvement Kata, and you can just Google Improvement Kata and you'll find his website and descriptive material. That's the idea of using the scientific method. We call it the experiment loop, but it's the same thing, to hypothesize, experiment, measure, inspect, and adapt to make progress toward that goal, to take small steps to make progress. So that's what we've done. We've synthesized OKRs, 4 Disciplines of Execution, and the Improvement Kata into evidence-based management. And of course, there's lots of sub-elements there, like a scientific method and things like that are part of this. So if you're using OKRs, great. And you might say that, but maybe you're having trouble making progress toward your objective. And evidence-based, especially if it's a stretch goal, in OKRs, they typically will talk about stretch goals. If it's not a stretch goal, you don't need EBM, because then OKRs are about making the numbers, doing the business that you know how to do. The stretch goals is where EBM might be useful. And if you're having trouble making progress toward that key objective, or the key objective, maybe adopting the idea of the experiment loop and meeting weekly to measure our progress, that is to say EBM, might help you make more progress toward those goals. Well, we're just about out of time. So thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed speaking with you. Hopefully this was a little bit useful in understanding it. And there's a whole bunch of links pasted in the comments there to all the different things that we're mentioning. Thank you, Bogdan and Boris, for being very diligent about those links. That's really great. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. It was
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
bye.
you.